Should I start soon or should we wait
Yeah,
a few
I
more
think
minutes?
we can get started. People can
Okay.
join after. Thank you.
So just confirming, can you see my screen now and can you hear me loud and clear? Okay, perfect. So, hey everyone, it's my pleasure to present about my work to you today. And what I'm going to talk today is not really about the topics that I'm researching on, I'm going to present tomorrow, but rather a methodology or a toolbox that I developed over the past few years. And that essentially aims researchers to help them to set up interactive studies, be it any kind of negotiation study or any kind of team activity in Qualtrics surveys. And the first question is really, why do we need yet another platform that allows real-time interaction between people in online studies, since we already have several approaches and several platforms that try to do this or try to mimic these. And to this end, I assembled a table that summarizes the different approaches that researchers can take when they want to set up interaction between participants. And as you may know, that since the replication crisis and since the increased demand on larger samples, especially on crowdsourced samples, the landscape of empirical research has changed quite a lot. And now there is an ever-increasing emphasis on doing these large-scale online studies. However, the problem is that in the fields that we are actively working in, we usually need some interaction between participants. And setting up these interactions, especially in real time, can be quite challenging. And for example, as what I label as the first type of interactive studies that I call the offline real-time interactions, these are set up in labs. And classically, this has been used in like physical computer labs where you would recruit 20 to 30 participants for a given time slot and then ask them to interact with each other. And we do have several platforms, several softwares that allow interaction within these offline settings. The problem is that these methods don't really work if you want to scale up a study. If you want to recruit, let's say, 1,000 participants because you have several conditions, this is not really a feasible method because it would take several months. The second type of implementations that I would classify as non-real-time interaction already offer researchers to conduct online studies, but each of these methods use a shortcut that falls short of actual real-time interaction, and instead of that, they introduce something that is either a bit problematic from a theoretical point of view or not necessarily allowed by the particular subfield that we are working on. For example, probably the easiest way to set up or mimic these interactions is to just recruit people in waves. For example, ask a group of participants to make decisions or to communicate messages on day one. And then for day two, recruit a second group of participants who would react and respond to the responses or to the decisions that the first group made. The problem is that while this sounds easy to set up, it's actually really labor intensive and error prone. And if there are other alternatives, I wouldn't really recommend this really labor intensive method. The second method, which is commonly called as a strategy method, in some disciplines is really not considered to be a valid approach, but essentially what it does, instead of a real-time interaction, it presents people with all potential actions and all potential behaviors that their partners could choose and ask them to select the response conditioned on every single possible behavior. So obviously there is this theoretical claim that this might change the mindset of how people interact, and this might focus from a more intuitive kind of decision making to a more deliberate, more rational decision making style. So obviously this is problematic if you are hypothesizing certain things about the decision making process. And again, it's not really real-time interaction, so there are obvious limitations on what can you implement. For example, I imagine that even with the strategy method, a negotiation study would be almost impossible to implement because it would require researchers to set up a whole branch or a whole tree of conditional logics based on what the other person might respond. And the final category that is especially frowned upon in certain disciplines that are more aligned with experimental economics is deception, is when researchers actually don't use real participants as the interactants. Rather, they either use confederates or, for example, they use a computer response, which replaces real participants. And the problem with that usually most institutional ethical review boards explicitly state that deception can be only used if it's necessary for the research design and should not be used out of only convenience. And what I see as a problem here is that, unfortunately, a lot of researchers don't have the tools or the resources to set up actually real-time interaction, and they have to resort to deception, not because their research design would require it, but simply out of convenience. So again, I feel this is only a second best approach if people want to study interaction, and there should be other more advanced methods that actually allow researchers to conduct real-time interactive studies. And this is where the first or the final category of these platforms or softwares come into picture, which can be labeled as online real-time interactive studies. However, one common attribute that all of these existing platforms have, that they are usually requiring at least some intermediate level of programming skills. For example, these standalone experimental platforms, such as O3, while they allow researchers to customize a lot in what kind of studies they want to set up, and they allow actual real-time interaction between even hundreds of participants, the researcher essentially has to learn a new programming language just to use this toolbox, which in my opinion is kind of an unrealistic expectation from all researchers. And even if the researchers themselves wouldn't be able to commit to learning a new language, they would have to hire a professional programmer to do so. So I believe this is especially problematic for smaller labs who don't have unlimited resources or who don't have this kind of research support. So this option is really not, can be really not considered for all researchers. The second option here would be to hire third-party services, for example, iDecision games, which are private companies specifically targeting this audience by offering to design custom experiments. And one advantage of relying on such services is that they can essentially implement whatever research design you have in mind, including very advanced features such as live video chat. On the flip side, the problem is that these are usually very expensive. And since these services are closed source and coming from for-profit companies, usually researchers have limited flexibility in what can they do with these existing surveys, whether they can customize them. And usually, in my own experience, this back and forth between the developer team and the research team can substantially slow down the research process. So instead of the researcher being able to make smaller edits, they always have to constantly communicate with this third-party company, which again can slow down substantially the research. And the final existing category, what I label is these specialized applications. For example, Chatplat, which was developed by Alison Wood Brooks. These are actually very good solutions if you want to look at a limited set of types of interactions. For example, if you want to look at open-ended chat between people. The downside of using these specialized applications is that they don't allow for any other type of interaction. For example, if you want to study allocation behavior or collaboration or cooperation instead of negotiation, you would have to find a different toolbox that was developed for that particular problem, and you wouldn't be able to easily just use the same overall framework and do whatever study you wish to have. So this is how I identified this gap in the existing set of tools. And I thought that it would be nice to have one tool that allows researchers to set up real-time interaction between participants. It doesn't require hiring a third-party company, or it doesn't require using programming extensive softwares. So essentially, my idea was to develop something that uses a platform that already exists and that already is familiar to a lot of researchers in our field, which is Qualtrics, the survey platform, and then add simple scripts to this existing platform that essentially introduces a whole new set of functionality to this platform. Namely, it introduces the ability to set up these real-time interactions between survey respondents. And this not only includes transmitting decisions, for example, allocations or whether to collaborate or to compete, or also have real-time chat, which is very essential in most of the conflict management research that we do. So in a nutshell, the three main attributes of SMARTRIQS is that there is no programming required. So any researchers can start using it even if they never had any background in JavaScript or any other web programming language. The second and maybe even more important feature is that it's completely free and open source. So you can not only access the existing study templates, but you can access the actual background scripts that operate the entire platform, which allows researchers to fully customize. So even if they don't like a certain feature of the existing platform, for example, how the matching is implemented, because the scripts are open source, they can decide to implement their own version of SMARTRIQS. And finally, to make it as convenient as possible for researchers, SMARTRIQS is fully integrated into Qualtrics. So you wouldn't have to download a separate software. You wouldn't have to download the resulting data from a third-party software and then manually integrate it. So whatever data you collect using this tool will show up in the default Qualtrics output file, including the chat logs. And fortunately, I'm going to show you this today, later in the second half of the session. And hopefully, if everything goes well, then I can demonstrate how you will be able to see the chat logs and the decisions that people make in the actual data file. And in a nutshell, this chart shows how SMARTRIQS works. So what is the basic architecture? So what you can see here on the left side is that these little icons represent individual Qualtrics respondents. And each of these surveys will have some inbuilt scripts in them that help to capture their decisions, and they actually help to send these decisions to a web server. And the good thing is that the researchers don't have to edit any of these scripts. So these scripts are actually hard-coded into these survey templates. The researchers only have to design the survey itself, how they would normally design a non-interactive study. And then after these decisions are transmitted to the web server, they are being processed. And for example, this is the stage when a response is retrieved and shared across the group. And then using the same scripts in the client surveys, the data is sent back to the other group members. So that's the philosophy or the basic architecture, how this works. And again, the good thing is that the researchers have to focus only on what's this left-hand side, only to design the client surveys, and they don't have to do anything with the backend. So they don't have to edit any of the scripts that handles the database. This is all set up on a default server. Of course, again, because this is all open source, if a researcher wants to modify the backend script for whatever reason, they have the opportunity to do so. But in that case, they will have to set up their own web server. This might be particularly useful if, for example, someone is planning to investigate sensitive data like health data, or try to ask people to potentially disclose sensitive personal information. In that case, it's not allowed to use this public default server. In that case, I would recommend the researcher to set up their own server. And just to go over the basic features of SMARTRIQS, especially how it compares to other similar platforms. The main features is that you can have an unlimited number of groups, which means that you can recruit hundreds or even thousands of participants in a day or at the same time. But there is a limitation on how many people can interact within each group. And currently, this limitation is up to 8 participants, which again means that you can have groups of 8 people, for example, 8 people entering one chat room, interacting with each other, making decisions. But at the same time, you can have an unlimited number of groups who are participating consecutively in the experiments. Similarly to other platforms, SMARTRIQS allows you to set up multiple stages of decisions, and also allows you to randomly assign people to different conditions. For example, if you want to manipulate what instructions are displayed to participants, or what decisions can the different roles make. And of course, it not only allows people to interact with each other and see the same instructions, it also allows you to set up different roles. And this is particularly important in economic experiments when there is usually a buyer and a seller, or for example, when you want to mimic market interactions. So SMARTRIQS is also capable of assigning these unique roles. And the good thing is that the researchers can completely customize how they want this assignment to be done. So they can either rely on the default random assignment, in which case the algorithm will take care of the randomization, or if it's desired, the researchers can also set up their own randomization methods. And for example, this is really useful if someone wants to set up confederate studies or studies with pre-assigned groups, for example, couples, because in this case, you wouldn't want participants to be completely randomly matched with each other, but you want to have some sort of control. And with SMARTRIQS, you can do that. And for example, how this would work, you would add one variable to the URL link to the survey and send a different link to the actual participants and the confederates, or send a different link to each member of one couple. So again, here it provides a lot of flexibility to researchers in how they want to set up the matching, either by using random or custom assignment. Since it's using Qualtrics as its core, you can essentially submit any kind of data between participants that are included in the basic Qualtrics platform. So this can include open and closed-ended text responses, numbers, scale responses. So essentially anything except for multimedia. And by which I mean is that people cannot submit in real time any audio files or any video. So if it's important for your experimental design that people have to see each other in real time or have a video chat through the experiment, then SMARTRIQS cannot do that. But anything other than that, for example, a text chat, that's perfectly feasible. And again, it provides a lot of flexibility in what type of chat or what type of communication you want to set up. This can be either turn-taking, more controlled kind of exchange of messages, or it can be a completely open real-time synchronous chat that would more mimic messaging apps. And here, researchers can also set up private or group chats, can have several stages of chats, can also interrupt, for example, a chat as participants to do some other task and then return to the same chat room later. Or you can even implement an asymmetric chat where, for example, one seller would have a private chat with each of the buyers and then after that, make a decision. Another feature that is frequently used in these online experiments is dropout management and what to do with people who quit the study. And SMARTRIQS is no exception. So I put a lot of effort in giving researchers the flexibility what to do when someone becomes inactive. And by default, in these cases, when someone becomes inactive in a group after a certain time, then the survey is terminated for each group members. And this is really good for those kind of studies that require an active participation from everyone in the group. However, people can also set up a version where the active participants can still continue participating. For example, if it's not essential that all 4 people in a group complete a study, if only 2 or 3 can still complete, then researchers can customize it in a way that the people can proceed without the inactive participants. In addition to that, researchers can also decide to actually replace these inactive participants by default responses or by bots. And researchers can also allow people to be matched with bots. And this is really useful if you don't want to lose any participants. For example, if they cannot find a partner during the matching, and if from your purposes, it doesn't make a huge difference if people are interacting with real people or with automated responses. I want to highlight one thing here, because the overall philosophy of behind developing SMARTRIQS was to not use deception. In the default version, it's always displayed to participants, whether they are interacting with real people or whether they are matched with non-human robots. So, because otherwise, it would kind of defeat the purpose of developing this entire platform. So I thought that it's better to be honest and just upfront with participants and let them know what kind of interaction they are currently in. Another feature that is highly useful, for example, when people want to set up competitions or compare performances within groups, is the built-in mathematical operations that add a new set of mathematical operations to the ones that exist in Qualtrics. So if you are somewhat familiar with Qualtrics, you might have noticed that they include simple operations like adding 2 numbers, subtracting numbers, multiplying numbers. But for example, they don't have more complex operations, for example, calculating the rank or summing a performance and then calculating an average. So this is what SMARTRIQS addresses. So with SMARTRIQS, you can easily calculate, for example, the rank between group members based on their performance, or you can set up auctions where people submit their bids and then it selects the highest or the second highest bidder. So again, this makes it much easier for researchers to set up negotiation studies or set up market simulations. And the final feature is the existence of the survey templates and the various demo experiments. So over the past few years, I not only developed this conceptual framework, but I also put a lot of effort into creating survey templates that researchers can use in their own research and download these templates and import to their own Qualtrics accounts. And then by modifying these templates a little bit, they can customize it to their own needs. And so before going into these demo experiments, I again want to just have a few words about how easy it is to set up experimental studies. And hopefully if we have enough time after that, I will also demonstrate it in action, like how it actually works. So if you are familiar with Qualtrics, then these screens are really, you have encountered these screens really frequently. If you're not familiar with Qualtrics at this point, it's perfectly fine. I wrote all these scripts and all these tutorial and step-by-step instructions with a target audience in mind who doesn't have any experience with even Qualtrics before. So if you follow the tutorial that I'm giving today, or the tutorial that's written up in one of my papers, that will guide you through these initial steps and show you how to set up the first interactive study without any existing background knowledge. And how editing is done in Qualtrics is usually in the survey flow editor or in the survey editor. And what you see here is essentially the main components of SMARTRIQS. And again, because researchers don't have to actually edit the scripts or do any programming, they have to set up these interactive studies by modifying so-called embedded data variables, which are in these green panels, and then inserting survey blocks, which are these gray blocks underneath the embedded data. And essentially, that's it. So no more editing is required. Researchers don't have to edit what's in these blocks. So these blocks come with a code already written in them, and researchers don't have to edit them. Researchers only have to change the order of these blocks, rearrange them, maybe copy them, and then what's essential is to define these variables before these various survey blocks. And then after a survey is done, I also created a feature that allows researchers to actually monitor the data collection in real time. And I created this for two reasons. The first is that, in my experience, Qualtrics doesn't really have a good real-time data collection monitor. So it lags a few minutes, especially if you have a large database. You frequently have to refresh, and it's really difficult to see, for example, which participants are in one group. So this progress monitor addresses that need. So with this tool, you can just enter the name of your study and immediately see where participants are at in the study. And it also shows you the actual group status, which can be really informative. For example, if there is any issue in matching, it would immediately show up on the screen, letting you know that people couldn't be matched with each other or they stuck on a particular screen. Yes, Ray, I see a question.
Yeah, so I just, to do this, you really have to have a very large size sample, because you have to have people all coming on at the same time to match, right?
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, I was planning to have a short section on best practices in how to use this platform for real data collection. And that is like those best practices that I gathered, and hopefully I'm going to summarize at the end of this presentation, don't only apply to SMARTRIQS, but to large-scale online sampling with any kind of interactive platforms. But you're perfectly right that for these kind of studies, usually we are talking about magnitudes of hundreds of participants, right? Because if you would only recruit a small group of people, then it would be really hard to ensure that there is always someone else on the other end who could participate at the same time. On that note, actually, one application of SMARTRIQS is to actually implement this in regular computer labs. So if you are planning to have a smaller group of participants to interact, let's say a focus group, you can still recruit them in a physical lab or ask them to show up at a certain time. And you can simply just distribute the survey URLs to them. And then they can either participate in that same physical lab or at the same time. So with that being said, I still had in mind larger groups of participants when I designed this platform. And everything, like all the philosophy behind it, that it has to be simple, rather computationally efficient, is really aiming towards those larger scale studies. And as I mentioned earlier, there are several different types of sample applications or demo surveys that currently exist. So I think I don't even know how many of these are currently. It looks like about 20, but these can be classified into classic economy games, which are usually these allocation games when people can send some monetary amount to the other person, and the other person can either react or don't really have any decision. Then the second category can be labeled as group interaction, which usually involves more than just a dyadic interaction. So these include, for example, a public goods game, when people can invest in a public good and they share the revenue, or various forms of competition when people work on a task and they can get rewards based on the ranking or the performance, and also various forms of market simulations like auctions or beauty contest games. And the final group of the demos, which I believe would be the most relevant to us, the researchers who are doing organizational behavior research and conflict management, is various types of communication, where you can either chat with another person in an open forum, or where you can actually decide which pre-written message to send to your partner, or when you can try to persuade the other person to adopt your views, or do the same things as part of a larger group. Yeah, I see there is a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I don't know if you'll plan to get to it later, like rules when participants drop out, right? Because I guess the matching logic only happens at the beginning, right? So if someone drops out, then whoever's still there, can they just continue normally throughout the survey, or how are they treated essentially?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this is what I just really briefly mentioned earlier. So researchers have flexibility in what to do in these cases. By default, how it's currently set up, the survey is terminated for all group members. This is because I come rather from an experimental econ background, and we usually get rid of all the data from groups who couldn't complete. But if you want to allow people to complete the study, then you can either allow them to just complete in smaller groups, or even replace these inactive participants with robots, with automated responses. And if you're more interested in that, we can discuss it later. I also have a short description on the website that shows you what are these different methods. But in my experience, if you follow these best practices, how to recruit people, and if the incentives are sufficiently high, then the attrition rates are usually very low. Like in my experience, when I use Prolific, the attrition rates are typically lower than 5%. So these cases will be relatively rare. Yeah, Peter?
Oh, sorry. Hi. Yeah, thanks, Andres. This is really great, and so thank you very much for doing this. A quick question, in part a follow-up on Tea's question in the chat. But if you're doing a study and you have participants from that are from classes, are like a subject pool, for example, are there FERPA, sort of, issues, or is it protected? Are the data protected? And some grant agencies require that as well. And then also, and Tea's question was about using the system for teaching.
I'm really glad that you asked this question, and because that's exactly what I was about to talk about on the next screen, highlighted under that final category. So indeed, the advantage of this, because it's so simple, that on the participants' end, it only requires them to have a smartphone or any device that can open a regular Qualtrics survey. So in the past, we have used this to simulate very short experiments in classroom settings at Carnegie Mellon. And you can also imagine using this in field settings, for example, with tablets or smartphones, where people don't even have access to computers. So the type of application is really broad. And going back to the other question you had regarding data protection, so that because the default SMARTRIQS server operates on an Amazon Web Services server, I couldn't guarantee like the full protection of sensitive data. And for those cases, I recommend researchers to actually install these scripts to their own website. And on the SMARTRIQS website, I have a step-by-step tutorial also detailing how to do that. It sounds like a complex procedure, but I guarantee it's really simple. So anyone who has a little bit of background with informational systems can easily set up. And once the background scripts are set up on your own private server, which I assume would be like protected and guaranteed that data cannot be shared with third parties, then you wouldn't have to modify anything afterwards. So then you can just focus on designing as many studies as you want. And in the past, I've had several researchers from all around the world who, for various reasons, and funding was one of them, couldn't use this default server, and they successfully implemented their own servers. And the advantage of having this own server is also, again, that you can just fully customize all the scripts, including the background scripts. And for example, one researcher group used it to get rid of the limitation of only 8 people per group, because they wanted to have a large scale auction where up to 40 people can actually bid for the same objects. And for them, it wasn't that essential that all 40 people remained in one group. So for them, attrition wasn't really an issue. And they ended up setting up the study that allowed 40 people to interact. And some of them dropped out, but the main point was that they could still pick the winner or pick the person who bid the most. So again, by using these custom servers, you can address these issues of sensitive data or these existing limitations. Yeah, but that's an excellent question.
Great,
and
thank you
here,
very much. Thank you.
In addition to these applications, I also wanted to highlight that essentially what kind of experiments can you set up is really depends on your research interests. So in the past, I personally have set up mostly studies from the fields of economics and management involving group decisions or reciprocity or moral behavior. But it's also possible to simulate market interactions, for example, in finance or marketing. And some of my colleagues have used it for more political science type of research, for example, persuasion, or where the focus was not really about decision, but how beliefs can spread and how people update their beliefs through communication. And again, the type of study you do is really depends on your research interest, and SMARTRIQS essentially provides you this overall framework where you can feed in your individual Qualtrics surveys and add this real-time interaction component or add these real-time chat to these surveys. Are there any questions about the conceptual background or the applications?
Just one building on Peter's, which is maybe a naive question because I'm not a programmer, about it wasn't quite clear to me about some of the data is being saved in Qualtrics on the default Qualtrics servers, which universities would have licenses with, and then other aspects of the data would be on other servers, either that the researcher sets up or I guess by default that you have set up. Is it a correct understanding?
Yes, that is correct. And so when researchers register for SMARTRIQS, I describe in detail like what kind of information. I think I called it the data sharing policy or something like that. And it describes in detail like what are the kind of data that are stored there. And researchers also have to agree that they are not sending sensitive data to these servers, for example, personal identifier or medical history or criminal history. But by default, the data that's saved on the SMARTRIQS server are only the group numbers, the roles, and the actual decisions. So all of these are anonymized. Not even, for example, if you are using mTurk or Prolific, not even the mTurk and Prolific IDs are saved on this server. Because what SMARTRIQS uses, those Qualtrics response IDs. So if you have worked with Qualtrics before, these are those long unique identifiers that start with R _, and then there's a long string of numbers and characters. So SMARTRIQS uses these to identify individual responses. So this guarantees anonymity. Like the one exception is if you explicitly ask participants for some personal data, and if you want that to send to other participants. So yeah, and that's another key aspect that I should highlight, that even if you have a complex survey featuring sensitive data, only that data is going to be transmitted and stored on the SMARTRIQS servers that you decide to transmit. For example, you can still obtain sensitive data from your participants, but if you ask them not to disclose this in the chat, or if you don't send these data to the server, then none of that will be stored in the SMARTRIQS server. So
that's really helpful. I think that helps clarify to Peter's question, because if you're not transmitting sensitive data, it sounds like you wouldn't necessarily need to go through some of the process to get authorizations that might be onerous, right? Yeah, because Qualtrics typically universities have licenses with already.
Yeah. Are there any other questions about the conceptual framework? because in the second half of the workshop, it's going to be more exciting and more interactive, because I'm planning to show you how to actually set up a sample study from scratch, just using one of these survey templates. And if I don't make any typos while setting up the survey, you can also test it and make decisions and interact with each other. And then following that, we can take a look at how the data will actually look like. And on this slide, I simply just listed all the existing resources. So I know that now you cannot click on these links, but if you're interested, I'm happy to share these slides with you. And most of these resources can be found at this website, smartriqs.com. And there are two relevant papers that I recommend to any researcher who is interested in setting up studies with SMARTRIQS. The first is this conceptual overview. That's essentially the same summary that I just gave. And that tells like what are the potential applications of SMARTRIQS, what are the features, the benefits and disadvantages. And then the second paper is what I'm going to cover in the second half of the workshop. It's really a practical guide, a step-by-step tutorial. So it's going to show how to actually implement a simple interactive study. And again, when I wrote this tutorial, I had in mind, for example, a research assistant who never had any background in setting up interactive studies or never even had background in Qualtrics. So in this tutorial, I really start from the absolute initial steps, including explaining what Qualtrics does, like what are the important concepts there. And I also link a lot of extra materials to people who are more interested in these advanced features, such as dropout management or creating multiple conditions or using sensitive data. But by just following this simple step-by-step tutorial, I hope that anyone can get a sense of what SMARTRIQS is capable of, and then trying to gauge whether their particular research design would be feasible. Of course, each research topic is very unique, so I highly encourage researchers to reach out to me if they want to set up a more complex study design, or if they have questions about whether they think SMARTRIQS would be the right tool for their own experiment. As a rule of thumb, my recommendation is that SMARTRIQS is useful for all types of interactions, except for two things. The first is when it's really important for you to have a live audio or video chat. Again, because SMARTRIQS doesn't have these features, it cannot allow people to interact. So in that case, I would recommend something else. And the other feature that is actually rather difficult to set up in Qualtrics is rematching within an experiment. So this is a really common thing, for example, in experimental economics, when people are playing a game over and over again, like through 20 rounds, and in each round, they are playing with a randomly chosen new participant. And so this is simply just not a feature that's in SMARTRIQS, because doing a rematching would require creating waiting rooms or rooms where all participants would enter between stages and then randomly reshuffle. But that would drastically slow down the entire procedure. And my philosophy behind developing SMARTRIQS is to create the simplest possible tool that still allows real-time interaction. So if your study doesn't feature video chat or audio chat and doesn't require to change the composition of the groups throughout the experiment, then usually that study can be set up using SMARTRIQS. And the particular details, like how difficult is set up, of course, varies based on your needs. But in principle, there are no practical challenges or no technical difficulties in doing that. So if there are no more questions about the concepts, that I'm happy to start the applied section. So in this second half of the workshop, I'm going to show you how to set up a classic dictator game between two people that also has a chat before the dictator makes the decision. And for those of you who are less familiar with this classic game, this is a dyadic interaction, which is widely used to study prosocial behavior and social preferences towards others. And essentially what happens is that participants are matched in pairs, and one of them is randomly assigned to the role of the allocator, while the other participant is in the role of the recipient. And at the beginning of the experiment, the allocator receives a sum of money, which in this demo will be 100 tokens. And then the allocator can decide how much of this endowment to keep and how much to transfer. And in this very simple version, the recipient doesn't have any decision. So they simply receive whatever amount is transferred to them. But again, on the website, I include more complex designs, for example, the ultimatum game, when the recipient can actually respond and decide to accept or reject the offer, or the trust game, where the recipient can send back a proportion of this endowment, and so on. And also, in addition to demonstrate how the chat feature works with SMARTRIQS, I'm going to also show you how to set up a brief chat before the allocator makes the decision. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides now and start sharing my screen. Just a second. Can you see my browser now and this OSF website? So the first step when designing SMARTRIQS surveys is really to visit this OSF repository. And this is the library of the existing study templates. So let me zoom in a little bit. If you have worked with Qualtrics survey templates before, then these file types might be familiar with you. So these are the QSF files that stand for Qualtrics survey files. And essentially, you can export and import all of your Qualtrics surveys into this file format. And here, these are the same templates that correspond to the demo experiments that are available on the website and that I briefly mentioned before. And here, what is my usual recommendation is to start with this template called the generic interactive survey template, or short GIST. And this template essentially has all the potential components that you might need. It even has more. For example, if you don't need chat, you can still download this template and then delete the chat component later. But this version has all the components that you might need. And what you have to do is to simply click on this, and you can ignore this horrendous text. It's not relevant, and just download this file. Let's say download it to this folder. Thank you for posting the link. And then you can log into your own Qualtrics account. Now I see that I have to log in again. So can you see my Qualtrics screen now? So this is the landing page of Qualtrics. And how you import surveys starts the same way. So you have to create a new project and create a survey from scratch. And here, let's say I'm saving it as IACM demo. And the only difference you have to do when you're using these imported surveys is, instead of creating a blank survey, we have to select import a QSF file, because we are going to import one of these templates that we just downloaded. And here we can import this generic interactive survey. And then in a moment, you will see how a SMARTRIQS survey looks like. So at the first sight, it looks very similar to regular Qualtrics surveys. And by the way, let me know if this is too small. I can still zoom in a little bit more so it's more visible. So what it has is these standard survey blocks, for example, instructions that you can customize and edit. And then here is the more important part. So you can see that there are these various blocks, for example, called the match block, that has these essential scripts that match participants with each other. You can even just collapse these, because the good thing, again, that you don't have to edit anything within these blocks. So there are these items that do their own thing, but you don't really have to worry about them. the same applies, for example, to the chat or the send or the get. So what these blocks do is that they each have a different function. The match matches people into groups. Then the chat allows them to communicate. The send block actually sends data to the server, and the get block retrieves data from the server. And the final type of block is called the complete block. And this essentially tells the SMARTRIQS server that this participant had completed the study. And this is really optional. If you don't have a complete block, it won't change the participant's experience in any way. But this is going to be really useful if you want to track participants' progress in real time, because it will let you know if, for example, a participant quit the survey after the interaction, but before completing the rest of the survey. So this is what the survey looks like. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the editing is done in the survey flow editor. So in this other view, and here you can already see that there are these lists of embedded data variables that are essentially the parameters that control who gets matched with whom, what is the group size, and what are the roles that participants are playing in. And for this demo, I already created a researcher account. If you are a first-time user of SMARTRIQS, you have to register for a researcher ID, which again is free and doesn't take more than 2 minutes. And there is a link on the website that allows you to generate an ID. And then we can name our study anything. And then the only necessarily or required variables that we have to define is the size of the group, which is 2 in this case because we are using a dyadic interaction. The number of stages or short num stages, which correspond to how many different decisions we want to transmit between participants. In most studies, this actually corresponds to the number of experimental stages. That's why I named it to be convenient. But in some cases, you might have multiple decisions within each experimental round. For example, imagine a game with punishment where the first person makes a decision, then the second person can make a punishment decision. So in that case, even though if this is one round, that would constitute as 2 stages, right? Because they're not doing it at the same time. And the next thing that we have to specify is the name of the roles. And then this is the function that lets you either randomize people into these 2 roles or lets you set up a custom role. So I can either say random here, in which case each participant will be randomly assigned either to the allocator or recipient, or I could just say allocator, in which case everyone who is opening this link would be assigned to the role of the allocator. And then if you had a copy of this survey that has the same parameters, but instead of allocator it says recipient, then everyone taking this other copy will be in the role of the recipient. Again, this might be useful, for example, if you are planning to do confederate studies where the research assistant would assume the role of one person and the real participants would be in the other role. But for simplicity, let's keep it random for now. And essentially, this is only the required parameters for matching. Everything else is optional. And I don't want to spend too much time describing what these optional parameters do. So there's a lot of extra information on the website. The only thing that I'm going to set up is this final one, which is called match alert. And I set this to yes. And this simply means that when participants are going to be matched, they will see a tiny notification in the title bar of their browser. So even if they navigate away to other tabs or open other windows, they will still see that they have been successfully matched with another person. Yeah, Ray?
So if you split it into two separate surveys like you were showing, what's the mechanism to keep them linked?
So that's an excellent question. And this is exactly the mechanism. So what's important here is to keep the researcher ID and the study ID the same. Okay. And then it doesn't matter whether it's one survey or multiple copies. As long as these two variables are same, then whichever client enters the experiment is going to be in the same database, because the main or the most important variable here is the study ID. And that also has another implication. For example, if you want to change any of these basic parameters, for example, if you want to change the size of the group or the number of the rounds, that also implies that you have to rename your study ID, right? Because the new group size or the new roles would be incompatible with the old study ID. So in this case, if that happens, and if you start to test the study, you would receive an error message that there was an inconsistency between the old and the new group size, and you have to rename the study. But as long as the study ID is the same and your researcher ID is the same, you will be able to match participants across surveys as well. Yeah, Peter?
Yeah, great, thanks. Kind of a follow-up on what Ray is just asking in terms of two aspects, two quick questions really. On the Open Science site, is there a notation, a way to say that here's the materials for the study that I just ran, and if you want to try to replicate that, here's the link, go to it, and it's all yours. So you actually, it's a way to really transfer materials to somebody else to do replication really quickly. And then in that same context, if you want to collaborate with people around the world, you could, is there a mechanism to say, okay, now we have 10 researchers in 10 different parts of the world coming together, all using the same materials and creating different, just, additional data sets. So I assume that's built in here, and I didn't really see exactly where.
So that is really up to the research community, right? So it's I created this open source tool, but I'm not maintaining like any active database or library, because I also have to focus on my own research. But there are already several researchers who posted their methods online, and for example, created their own much more complex studies that are included here in the demos. And I strongly agree with the initiative that researchers should be as open and transparent as possible. And in my own research, I always upload these, the final QSF files that I used in the actual survey. For example, in the work that I'm going to present tomorrow, those QSF files are also available in the project that we have with my co-author. So I would, to get back to your question, it really depends on the research community. I feel that if I would be more than happy if there was a strong initiative to create this collaborative network of researchers who are using SMARTRIQS and then upload libraries. But because this is a relatively new tool, I'm not aware of any existing like database other than these sample demo experiments that I have on the website. So yeah, so after we set up these required parameters and we can leave the optional parameters blank, then essentially this would already allow us to match people in pairs. So if I publish this study right now, we could already have an open chat, but we wouldn't be able to make any decisions because that part has not been added to the study yet. So in order to do that, we have to go back to this survey editor. And let's say after this chat, we can add the new block called, let's say, allocator decision. And then just to keep it very simple, I'm going to add a slider type of question where we ask the allocator to make an allocation decision. And here, let's say we label this as your transfer, and we ask the allocator to make a transfer decision between 0 and 100 units. And one important aspect to remember here is that, and this applies to non-interactive studies as well, when you ask people to respond in Qualtrics, it's highly recommended to check the add requirements and to force response. And this is really critical in SMARTRIQS because if people are allowed to submit a page without providing a response, then their partner would interpret that as they are still waiting for the decision. So in that case, the survey would be terminated because the allocator never made a decision. So
I have a question related to that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've thought about this, but I rarely require forced response, and this is to do with IRB issues, and in that we say you can skip any question that you don't feel comfortable answering. And I don't know, this is something I tend to leave with request response. I can see why logistically that wouldn't be feasible to not have a forced response, but I don't know, because then, and also people feel forced if they're making the right decision. I didn't know if you had thoughts on that related to this, but I just thought I would flag it. Yeah.
So my initial thought is that, again, it's only recommended to force those responses that you want to transmit across participants. You can still ask, for example, a bunch of demographic or more sensitive questions that are entirely optional. But again, for practical reasons, probably how I would do it is I would add the disclaimer at the beginning of the survey that in order to have an interactive experience, there will be certain decisions that will be transmitted to your partner. And because without that, the problem is that there wouldn't be interaction, right? So if, for example, in this case, the allocator is not willing to make a decision, then the interaction stops and the survey gets terminated.
Yeah, no, I like that idea of just having the disclaimer,
Yeah.
it being very clear. Yeah, thank you.
Another workaround might be, for example, to allow participants to indicate that I have no preference or I'm not willing to provide a response, and then submit this text response. Yeah, so that would be another way to set this up. And yeah, that's a good point. So essentially, after we set this up, then the allocator can already make a decision. But currently, how we set this up is that because this is not only displayed to the allocator, like without doing anything, now both people would see this decision after the chat. So in order to make sure that all the people in the role of the allocator are making decision, we have to add a conditional branch in this survey editor. And then we can base this conditional branch on the variable that's called participant role. And essentially what we are telling Qualtrics now is that only those participants who have been assigned randomly to the role of the allocator are going to be displayed this particular block, which is this allocator decision. And then we also have to move these other elements, which are essentially responsible for sending this decision to the server. So the first step that we have to do, we have to refer what is that data point that we want to submit. And if you are familiar with Qualtrics, you might have heard about the piped text. So the piped text is essentially a dynamic variable that Qualtrics uses. So you can use a response from a previous question to embed in a later question, or to display again to participants. And this is also used to set up variables in the survey flow. And here, what we are interested in particular, we want to Qualtrics let know that we want to save this response from the allocator's decision in the previous block. And in order to do that, we have to find this survey question, which I believe I saved this as transfer. And here, this is the variable that we want to insert. And if you select it, will look like this ugly string. This is just for, this is the Qualtrics notation that shows that it's going to retrieve this first response to this question. And then the next part is essentially letting Qualtrics know which variable we want to transfer. And here we already saved this variable named response. We want to send this variable. And the other thing we have to define is which stage this variable corresponds to. So in this case, I'm going to just enter 1 because this is a single stage study. But for example, if you had repeated interaction or multiple stages, you could set any number here. And that would mean that this particular decision corresponds to that stage and it's going to be stored on the server under that stage. And then finally, we have this default send block that is responsible for actually sending the data to the server. But from the allocator's point of view, this is all what we need to set up. So we don't have to add anything else. If we want to have an even better experience for the participants, we can set up a feedback screen that informs them about their best decision and how much they have transferred. But in order for the recipient to receive the amount of money, there is really no other parts that we have to set up. But of course, we also have to set up now the recipient's part, because now what we have done so far is ask the allocator to make a decision and submit this choice to the server. But we also have to retrieve this server from the other end. And in order to do that, we have to create another branch. But this time, oops, not recipient, but participant role. But this time, the participant role is the recipient. And in this case, what we are going to do is that all participants who are assigned to this role are going to try to retrieve this data that the allocator submitted. And how SMARTRIQS works is that it keeps checking the status of the server. And as long as the field that you try to retrieve is blank, it waits. And as soon as it's populated, because your partner submitted the response, then it signals that it retrieved this data successfully, and then it saves it to your local Qualtrics variable, which you can use later in your study in any way. For example, you can display this variable, or you can create conditional logics based on this variable. So again, how this works is really simple. We just have to define a few variables that lets Qualtrics know like which data we want to retrieve. And here we have to define the name of the role, whose data we are interested in, what stage we want to retrieve. And finally, we have to name a variable that we want to save this retrieved data. And just for convenience, I call it response, but it can be anything. It can be transfer 1 or decision 1, anything really, it's up to you. And then I also have to create this blank variable that's going to get populated later when it successfully retrieves the value. And this second block has optional parameters. Again, there is more information about what these mean, but for this basic experiment, we don't have to define any of these variables. And the final part is this actual get block. So this is similar to the send, but it does the opposite. So it has these embedded scripts that lets you retrieve this data that we defined earlier and then save it to the response. And now we are almost ready, but so now the interaction would work, but we want to also notify people about the outcome, right? So in addition to these, we want to add a feedback block, which can be really simple. Let's say to keep it as simple as possible, we can just tell people that the allocator has transferred a certain amount. And here we can also use this the same function that we used before, this pipe text, where we can embed the data. And here we want to embed this data that we labeled response. Again, that was this piece of variable to which the allocator's decision gets saved. So it looks like this in the survey editor. Again, it has this field code, but in the actual survey, participants will see an amount here. And that amount should correspond to the exact decision that the allocator has made. And one final thing, we have to make sure that this feedback is displayed to everyone, because now we added it here. So now it would be displayed only to the recipients, but ideally we want to display it to everyone. So we can move it out of this branch. And now you can see the full survey flow here. Let me collapse these. So after the matching, which happens at this point, there are these parameters for the matching. After the matching, there will be chat. And these are just variables that control the chat, but we don't have to worry about them for now. And after the chat, participants do different things based on their role. So again, the allocator is going to make this decision, and then the recipient is going to wait for them until the decision is made. And then both people are going to learn about the feedback. And now comes the exciting part. So I hope I didn't make any typos in the variable names. But of course, because this is a live demo, it can always go wrong in many ways. But let's try. So let me activate this survey, and then I'm going to post this link to the chat. And you can also follow this on my own screen. So can you see this first screen that says Chicago booth and the initial landing page? Okay. So this is the same that you should see. And again, you can customize instructions to whichever instructions you prefer. And of course, get rid of this logo and use your own university template. And then the next screen, this is just the basic default disclaimer. This can be also customized that I explain on the website how. So if you don't like this text, you can use anything else here. And the next is the actual matching screen, which, as you notice now, went really quickly because we were doing it at the same time. And in my experience, if you are using these large crowdsourced networks, and this is referring back to earlier questions, then this is the participants' experience on average. Like they don't really even have time to read the instructions for that matching screen because matching is going so quickly. And then on the next screen, so this is the, oh, hi, Peter. So this is the chat. So remember that in this particular setup, we wanted to have the chat between the allocator and the recipient before the actual decision is made. And this is how a basic setup of the chat works. This is an unconstrained chat. So participants are not required to spend any time on there. They can exit the chat whenever they want by clicking this button. On the other hand, they can take as much time as they want. But this is just one setup. In most studies, I assume you would want to have a stricter control over how much time people spend on chatting. And in those cases, you can actually force people to spend, let's say, exactly 3 minutes on this page. You can also customize, of course, like what kind of instructions is displayed here. And what's also really useful, you can add different questions to this same page. For example, if you want to display private information, or for example, if you want people to rate how the conversation goes, you can ask these questions under or over this chat. And for now, let's exit the chat. And then again, there is a short message that lets you know that it ended. And I believe that I was the recipient in this group. So now what my site says that I'm waiting for my partner. Oh, thank you very much. You were very generous. So, and this was indeed the amount that you transferred, right? Okay. Yeah, so this is essentially how it works. So I had to wait until my partner made the decision and I saw that text. And after that, I received this amount. And then the next screen essentially says that the demo experiment has ended. And now I want to also show you, so if we go back to the survey flow and now remember that the researcher ID was IACM and dictator demo was the study ID. I want to show you the progress monitor, which is this website. Let me zoom in a bit more here. So again, I provide a link to this small tool that allows you to check the progress of the data collection in real time. Here you can enter the same researcher ID that we had in the survey flow, and then the study ID. And then essentially what it shows how this study is going in real time. So as you can see here, there were 2 groups who have completed the study. And I assume I was in group 2 because only this group had 95 tokens transmitted. But again, going back to earlier questions, this is all the data that's being saved on the server. So you see that this is completely anonymous, and you only see these response IDs that stand for the survey IDs, and not to the worker IDs that are from Amazon or Prolific. And then here in the other columns, you see condition. And for now, it says null because we only use a single condition in this experiment. We did not randomly assign people to different conditions. But if you had multiple conditions within a survey, then you would see it here, like which condition each group was assigned to. On the top, you also see this brief summary of how many groups have fully completed the study, how many groups are still in matching. So now you can see that there is one participant who is currently trying to get matched. And now this participant will have to wait until someone else also opens the link and enters the matching stage. You can see now that now someone else also joined. So now this group number 4, is entering the chat stage now. And after the chat ended, you will also see like these fields are going to be populated whenever the allocator makes a decision. And then if both fields are complete, then this timestamp that says last active will change to completed. And if you want to have an even more detailed look, I'm not going to show you, but you can also just download this by generating a CSV file. This is really not important, only if you feel that there is something not working in your survey and you want to take a more detailed look. But for now, let me show you how the data looks like in Qualtrics, which is perhaps more interesting. So you can just go to the regular data and analysis panel. And this might take a little bit of a time, because whenever you launch a new study, the first time Qualtrics processes the data might take a little bit more. But let's hope that this is going to process the data in a few seconds. Meanwhile, I'm happy to address any questions. So we essentially reached the end of the practical demo. So the only thing I'm going to show you how the data looks like. And from now on, I'm happy to answer all kinds of questions that you might have. Yeah, Peter?
Yeah, so to what extent can it be automated so that it's, let's say you have, let's say you want 20 participants to show up at the same time, and it's set up so you distribute the link, the Qualtrics link, and can it run when let's say you get a threshold, let's say you invite 25 people to participate in one session, can it start at, let's say 20, so you know you have what you want, and you can set it for any time of day or night, and so you don't have to be online? Or do you have to be online and monitor in real time?
Well, so the data collection monitor is just an extra tool, but that's not required. So if you prefer, you can just launch your study on Network on Prolific. And I know many researchers who didn't even know the existence of this data progress monitor. So if you trust your survey and the participants, and you're not worried about any issues, then you can just launch the study and it goes automatically. However, I usually recommend, at least when you are first piloting the study, to check this data progress monitor, because at least it lets you know if you see these green fields, it's usually a good sign. It indicates that people can complete it without any issue. For example, if there were issues in finding partners or with dropouts, then these fields would be red and they would say terminated. And then if that happens, then you would have to take a closer look at the data that's again collected here in Qualtrics to try to identify what was the issue here. So now I see there are some responses, so let's download the data. And by the way, I really don't recommend using this online data viewer because you have to manually add all the fields. So it's just easier if we actually download the data file. Okay, meanwhile, I see there is another question. Yeah.
So I was curious, from your experience, what are some of the common troubleshooting errors that occur? I mean, I mean,
That's
I feel
also,
like, you know,
yeah.
with all the embedded data, sometimes, you know, you might just enter something wrong and then you just, you know, don't know what's going on.
So I'm going to address like general best practices with online data collection, but with SMARTRIQS specifically, the number one type of issue is typos. For example, imagine if we go back to the survey flow, and because in programming, you have to be really accurate. So if I made a typo here, instead of allocator, this was a lowercase allocator, then the software wouldn't recognize which role I meant. And usually when researchers have issues setting up studies, either there is a typo in the variable name, or for example, they accidentally enter a space before, and that already changes the variable. But when it comes to the technical background, I don't remember any consistent issues with it. So there might be idiosyncratic issues that are more related to the internet connection of the clients. So it might occur if a participant has unreliable internet connection, or their browser is out of memory, or something happens there, then they might drop out of the study or be perceived from the server as being dropped out, even though they think they are participating. So this can even happen when you are doing a non-interactive study, when a participant starts a Qualtrics survey and then their internet connection stops, and then they receive some error message. But these are not specific to SMARTRIQS, more general to Qualtrics in general. And Peter, just 1 second. So I just wanted to show you, this is what the survey data looks like. So it's pretty similar to what you see in a regular survey. And I wanted to show you, these are the interesting variables in the second half. For example, here you can see the same researcher ID, the study ID. This group ID variable lets you identify easily which person was in which group. And then you have these participant roles. So these would correspond to the role that actual participant played. And then if you are interested in what was the transfer, you can also just find that variable here. Obviously, this was only populated for the allocators. And then finally, if you're interested in the chats, then there is this variable called chat log. And there is just one thing here that I haven't figured out as of today, that why these weird characters keep occurring. But if they annoy you, you can just replace all of these. And if you do that, then you can see that all these chats will be formatted just like how the chats were formatted in real time. For example, you can see that these were the same in the same group. So this was, I think, the allocator. Yeah, this first person was here, the allocator, and the next person was the recipient. And I know it's a little bit redundant because the full chat log is saved for all participants within a group, but I think it's safer to have more data than risking losing like half of the data if, for example, one participant has an issue. And this is also advantageous even in the case if someone drops out or their survey gets terminated, you will still see their responses to their partners. And then you can use this data however you would like run some sentiment analysis, which, by the way, Mike Yeoman is going to have an excellent workshop. I'm not sure if he already had that. But yeah, you can do whatever you wish with these open-ended data. And then that's pretty much it. So you don't have to open any other software or download any other tool. So all this crucial data is going to be automatically saved within Qualtrics. Yeah, Peter?
Just real quickly, how are people handling compensation for, let's say, a reward for participation in the study and or for performance in the task?
So in SMARTRIQS, this is usually just informing participants, right? Because like the administration is done on the participant recruitment website, for example, on Enter or on Prolific. What you can do, for example, is to use these numbers or use these transfer values and link them to the prolific IDs or the entered worker IDs that people provided. For example, if this was a prolific study, on this first page, I would ask people to enter their worker ID. And then I could later match these IDs to their actual payments. But the actual administration of the payouts, that is done on the initial website, what you're using. Or for example, if you're using a physical lab, then the RAs could check the Qualtrics data file and look up which student ID was corresponding to which payment. So now we still have a little bit of time, I think. Can you see my presentation screen? I'm not sure. Let me reshare. So you should see the best practices screen, right? Okay. So here, I just listed a few of the best practices that in my experience work really well when you are using these large scale platforms like Prolific or Enter. And these are also best practices that I list on the website. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but really the gist of it is try to take actions that will guarantee a steady flow of participants, right? Because the biggest issue when running interactive studies online is if people are not in synchrony and they cannot find a partners to interact with. And in my experience, probably the best way is to publish smaller batches of participants more frequently rather than publishing one large batch of available spots. And this will kind of guarantee that participants will keep seeing your study among the top hits, so they will participate in that. And on that note, I highly recommend not using these popular third-party services like TurkPrime and Cloud Research or Qualtrics panels, because they each have some inbuilt mechanism that actually artificially reduces the recruitment speeds. So they have various reasons to do so. But if you're using Cloud Research, the recruitment speeds are kind of unpredictable. And that's really not desirable when you want to have real-time interaction, because it will make it really hard to find partners for people. The time of the week also matters a lot. In my experience, the best is to run these studies on weekday afternoons. Other than that, you might have difficulties in finding enough participants to participate online. And another recommendation that is often overlooked is to have the strictest eligibility criteria possible. Because unlike in individual studies, here you really want to get rid of or eliminate attraction to the lowest levels possible. So you don't want to risk hiring a lot of inattentive workers or people who might be less motivated to complete the survey. And for an example, I recommend setting like 100% approval rate as the lowest limit. And this is a little known fact that the distribution of these approval ratings on this platform is so extremely skewed that even if you set something like 95%, that will include essentially everyone. So it's not restrictive at all. And I frequently see other researchers saying that they use the really strict criteria, for example, 90%, but actually that's not restricting participation to anyone. So again, I really recommend to set the strictest possible, because even then you will have a large enough pool of people to sample from. And then going back to earlier comments, it's important to also include these disclaimers even before participants start the study, and probably also throughout the study, to inform them that they are going to interact in real time with other people. So please be mindful of others' time and try to participate only if you can guarantee undivided attention to this study. So again, in my experience, if you do all these steps, and I used Prolific recently, usually I don't run into any systemic issues. They might be idiosyncratic problems with connections, but there shouldn't be like a major obstacle, like technical issues that prevent people from interacting. And as a final note, I also recommend to pay participants slightly more than you would normally pay for a non-interactive study. And this is simply because these studies involve more waiting, which can be a bit more frustrating. And it's better to compensate people for this extra time that they have to spend on just waiting for their partners or being matched. And this is a really recent advice, if you are using Prolific to recruit people, they have this recent feature that's called the rate limiter. And if you want to do any kind of interactive study, you absolutely have to contact their support and turn this off. Because if this feature is on, you are going to get like 10 people in 1 hour. Because this is, again, a tool, a feature that artificially slows down recruitment. But if this is turned off, you are going to get hundreds of participants in a matter of minutes. So you won't have any issue with finding participants. And that essentially concludes these best practices for the data collection in general. So this is not only for SMARTRIQS. I think these advice can be useful for any kind of interactive studies online. And now I see that multiple people asked for the link to the slides. So I don't have these slides. I haven't made them available public yet. I think the easiest if you just send me an email and I can send you, and I'm typing in my email address here. I hope I didn't make any typos. It's Andras Molnar, my full name, and then chicagoproof.edu. So if you just contact via that email, I can send these slides. And if you already have ideas about what type of research you're planning to implement, or questions about whether a particular design would be feasible, I'm also more than happy to address those questions and help you decide. Are there any? I know we are a little bit already over time, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much for all your work.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really great. Super interesting.
Thank you. Well, and I see another question. So I know that this session is going to be recorded, and I assume that we can make it available on the ISCM website. But I think that if the ISCM organizers won't have any issue with that, I'm also happy to make this available on the SMARTRIQS website. So if people need or want to rewatch this tutorial, then they can do so.
Well, thank you. This is very helpful. I actually ran across your platform a few months ago and sent it to Taya and another PhD student we're working with. And I got it to work. It was, I'm somewhat familiar with that side of Qualtrics. So it was super helpful to see that you were going to give a presentation about it today. So thank you.
Have you already collected data with it?
No, Taya received a grant recently from the John Templeton Foundation to study honesty, and one of the projects under the grant is studying honesty in teams. Right, the plan was to run lab studies, but of course it wasn't possible. So I looked at options on running these studies online, and I ran across your platform. So I ran some tests and I ran it with them, but we haven't started the project yet. We will hopefully in the next few months. So we'll probably find a use for it.
In any case, let me know if you have any questions. I assume you're also in Pittsburgh, right?
Yes, yes.
So if you want, because I'm also still in Pittsburgh, like you can see from my background, I haven't moved to Chicago yet. So we can even meet in person in the next month or so if you want to.
That would be nice. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Andres. Have a great day.
Okay. You too. Bye.